Okay, so today we are chatting all about expectations, setting expectations, and why sometimes our expectations might get lost in translation as much as we feel like we are consistently saying the same thing over and over again, which might be part of our problem. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Essentially, we're going to go through three main tips to help us deliver effective feedback that allow us to set and maintain our expectations so that we can achieve results that we want both for ourselves and for our team. So if you joined last session, part one of our 5-part series, we talked about the resources that we juggle every day. So we looked at our time, our skills, our energy, our knowledge / our team's knowledge, and also our environment. So we're constantly in flux with all of these moving pieces. And in addition to that, our team members have the same things going on. They're juggling their resources as well. And in the last session, we introduced how we innately manage resources, two personality partners, as we like to call them, that are used to innately manage these resources. So how we look at managing our time, our energy, and our skills effectively, specifically when it comes to navigating tasks, to processes, to procedures, and to collaboration. So last session, we looked at our builders and maintainers and established that they are a yin and a yang partnership. And so in order to have a solid and sustainable organization, one that's focused both on growth and sustainability so that we can effectively serve our clientele, we need to have both within an organization. So if you didn't have a chance to catch last week's session, we do have a recording of it. You're welcome to go back and check that out so that you can start to understand who you can lean on for strategy, where you can leverage your team's strengths in terms of process versus strategy, and who you can rely on when it comes to change, advocating for change, and perhaps who you need to provide a little bit more context for when it comes to organizational change as well. So those are some pieces from last session, but now we're moving into taking this information and at some point in our working relationship with one another, there comes a time where we need to both communicate expectations and reevaluate and reset expectations. And we can do that a couple of different ways. Of course, there are more formal ways, but the informal ways to manage and set these expectations is through providing feedback. And when I say feedback, I mean that in both the positive and the constructive sense. So if you look at what we like to refer to as our feedback tool belt here, you can see that acknowledgement is used for meeting expectations. So when we're able to acknowledge that somebody is showing up, that they're a valuable and contributing member to our organization and to our overall processes, we can say a simple thank you. We acknowledge that they are showing up, that they're meeting our expectations, and they're perfectly on track for what we need them to be doing in their role. They're excelling, and that's wonderful. When we want to commend somebody for going above and beyond, then we utilize praise. And that's, a form of feedback that should be reserved for those times when somebody goes above and beyond. I just want to point out the stark difference between acknowledgement and praise. And we will get into some of those differences in our session next Tuesday on motivating for excellence. So looking at what that deficit is to get us from acknowledgement to praise, or from meeting expectations to exceeding expectations. But what we're focusing on today is on the left-hand side of this chart here, the constructive feedback piece for when we need to course correct and provide an opportunity for development, or to get our team back on track towards the expectations that we have set for them. Now, when it comes to setting expectations, and also more importantly, being able to provide effective feedback, there are 3 common barriers that we have identified. And these 3 barriers, although there might be others, these are the high-level 3 barriers that we notice with a lot of our clients when they say, my feedback just isn't landing, or my team doesn't totally understand my expectations. We're going to dive into what these 3 are, and then we'll give you 3 solutions to rectify some of these common barriers that we see. And these solutions are easy to implement. You can walk out of this session and test them out with your team right away. So let's dive into the first common barrier that we see. It's that our expectations aren't established or understood early on in the process. It makes it very difficult to provide feedback when someone says, I didn't realize that was an expectation, right? So that's potentially one reason why our feedback isn't totally landing, because the person you're providing feedback to has no idea that they've done something wrong or that they need course correcting. Now, this is usually something we identify in a reactive sense when we say, oh, I didn't understand that my expectations weren't clear. We're going to get into a couple of ways to make sure that our expectations are crystal clear from the get-go, so our team is all rowing in the same direction, or are all rowing in the same direction, and are clear on what those expectations mean. Our second barrier to delivering effective feedback is that we're sometimes overwhelming our teams with feedback. So this can also be referred to as the feedback dump. When you show up with a list of feedback for your team members and think you can provide all of that information and it will land, they'll be able to digest it, and then they'll be able to go out and action it. So the feedback dump is something that is very real. And normally we see this when we don't have an informal feedback loop. So we see this a lot with performance reviews and those scheduled, regularly cadenced one-on-ones where we have a running document and all of the feedback is presented in one go. That's what we mean when we refer to this feedback dump, and how overwhelming it can be for team members to receive all of this feedback, both constructive and positive, in one shot. And finally, our third barrier to providing and delivering effective feedback is that we assume that how we digest or feel about feedback is how somebody else digests or feels about feedback. Now, this could be an aversion to feedback, and we might say, I just don't think they're going to feel great after I deliver this feedback, right? That's an assumption that we're making about the way somebody else will interpret what we're going to say that might not totally be rooted in fact. The other side is, I love getting feedback, and I'm okay when people are totally upfront and blunt with me. Well, somebody on the other side might not feel the same way, and they might need to take some time to digest that feedback, to synthesize it, to understand where you're coming from, and then to come back and have a productive conversation. Because at the end of the day, we have different reactions to feedback, and it's really important to understand that. So in summarizing our three barriers, we look at expectations, we're looking at capacity of individuals for retaining that feedback, and finally, a need for individuality and to understand individuality when providing feedback. So now we've talked about these three barriers, but at the crux of all of these three is one common thread and one common concept. And that is assumptions. Okay, so we hear often, they should know, they will, we've discussed, and all of these lead-in sentences are sometimes rooted in fact. They may be true, but sometimes there's something that's not so factual about these sentences that we need to dive into a little bit more to see if these are assumptions that we're making when we lead off with these sentences, or whether they're rooted in fact and we're actually able to say, hey, I have delivered this feedback in the past, so they should know, right? We're going to get into some of those solutions and some ways that we can axe those sentences and eliminate a lack of clarity and limit, or I guess provide just the right amount of information, I should say, to limit animosity and also to alleviate any unprecedented anxiety that we might feel going into these feedback conversations. These are all assumptions that we make, whether they're assumptions rooted in our own experience, assumptions rooted in experiences that we've observed. No matter what it is, these barriers are rooted in assumption, and we're going to get into a couple of ways that we can address these assumptions today. So the first thing I'd like to really point out when it comes to expectation management is understanding whether these expectations have been communicated, and beyond that, communicated clearly and frequently. So if the answer is no, then that is an assumption, right? We're assuming that people know what we expect and that they have the same expectations that we do. And we know that we all come from different walks of life, from different backgrounds, different educational experiences. So bringing that information in and assuming that everybody is on a level playing field when it comes to expectations or the meaning of something is a complete assumption, right? We want to make sure that we're crystal clear and understanding that we have different definitions and we all see the world in different ways through different lenses. If we have communicated these assumptions or these expectations, apologies, then I would like to point out that these are more perceptions. However, they still might need some work, okay? So instead, we need to confirm the understanding of these expectations, reiterate what we've spoken about, which brings us closer to being on the same page. Through careful questioning, it also allows us to understand where the miscommunications were. So yes, I remember the conversation might be that confirmation of expectation, but I thought you were talking about something totally different. Could be the follow-up. Where did we miss the mark? And how can we align to make sure that we're on the same page moving forward? So let's start with the very simple piece. Have we communicated our expectations? And there are a couple of very easy ways that we can do that early on. Although I do want to put the caveat out there that we might do these early on, but we need to continuously express and relay these expectations to our team members because these expectations also might change and only we as leaders know that up here unless it's communicated. So the first and easy way to communicate expectations is through job descriptions. Of course, who's responsible for what does that mean for them, and how will they know that they've achieved success or they've met those expectations? We need to have clear understanding of what that looks like written out so somebody can go back and reference that. And it also allows you as the leader to have a tool to go back and reference in writing. The second piece are meeting agendas. What are people showing up with, right? They act almost as informal guidelines towards bigger deadlines. So we're saying today we're focusing on this information. And that primes your team to come prepared with the information that they need in order to have a productive conversation. Whether that's a feedback conversation, whether that's a conversation about moving a project forward, this also helps you gauge performance by setting your team up for success and preparedness. When we're having feedback conversations, one of the ways that you can continue to set these clear expectations is to follow up in writing via email or in a working running document, a live document that you can both reference. Essentially, and this is one thing that we see quite often with our clients, is not closing the loop on reiterating or reestablishing these expectations. So once they have the conversation, then it's done. Everybody walks away, assuming that it's going to be actioned or remembered. But in going back to what we spoke about earlier, people do have reactions to certain feedback. So it's important to remember that in a feedback moment, somebody might be having an emotional reaction, which actually inhibits their digestion of information to a certain degree. So a follow-up email makes sure that we're crystal clear on our expectations, we've communicated what we've spoken about, and then we've set a follow-up time to reconvene and discuss if necessary, or at least a deadline for which we'd like to see some progress made. And finally, tracking deadlines is a great way to set clear expectations, and that can be in a number of different ways. So that could be for project management, as I mentioned, that could be for tasks, that could be just for a regular feedback session. But either way, having those deadlines and those goals allows you to track progress and to set your expectations, and then to reevaluate and communicate those expectations or communicate about capacity when meeting those expectations. Because we know that in this world, we need to be agile and adaptable. So in tracking those deadlines, we can also say, does this need to move based on capacity? Do we need to reprioritize? What does that look like for us in this moment? Which brings us to our second tip for improving our feedback delivery, and that is understanding capacity. Now, we recently took an NLP course, and they spoke about how we interact with our environment, and the amount of information that's coming at us in any given second is 26 million bits of information. So we observe that and digest that through our 5 senses, and we synthesize only 126 bits of information per second. So that's a lot of lost information that's coming at us that we can actually retain and make sense of in a single second. On the outside, we, whether that's react or act upon the information that we've synthesized on the other side, that 126 bits of information, that's what we choose to act on. So it would be amiss as a leader to say that if we show up with our laundry list of information, that our team members are able to sit there and synthesize everything that needs to be done and take that and action it right away. What we can do and what we suggest that you do when it comes to improving your feedback delivery is in remembering that capacity is a real thing, to not overwhelm, but instead to focus on the timeliness. So anchor your feedback to an instance where feedback is needed, right? That could be instant, that could be booking a meeting to speak about feedback in that moment, but the meeting will be in the future with a clear agenda of what you'll be talking about, right? Make sure there's some timeliness so that the action is fresh enough that it can be remembered. The next thing that I'd like to really emphasize is focusing on 1 to 3 pieces of feedback in one given conversation. It gives the person, the recipient of the feedback, the opportunity to say, okay, I've got 3 things, 1 to 3 things that I can work on, that I can move the needle forward on, rather than it's like cleaning out your fridge when things have been sitting in there for so long. You know what I mean? And it's you're cleaning out Thanksgiving dinner and you have a million dishes that you need to get rid of versus I made leftovers last night and I have 1 dish that I need to clean. There are different analogies, obviously, that we can use. So choose your own adventure with that, but really focusing on a small amount of feedback more informally and more frequently will help with your feedback delivery. The next piece is being very specific with what it is that not only you're providing feedback on, but what the next steps should be. Do you need to see improvement by a certain date? Do you need to have a follow-up conversation because maybe they need time to digest that feedback? Being specific about not only the feedback, the instances, any specific examples you can provide, or walking them through a step-by-step process if needed as well, and that's the type of feedback you're providing. But either way, being very specific at every step of the way so that the person who is receiving the feedback has a more objective and systematic way to follow that feedback. Then we follow up with an email or something in writing to formalize that conversation and to reiterate that conversation and track when you'll be having that follow-up conversation. Again, to hold everybody accountable to that feedback, to that conversation, and perhaps to those deadlines or whatever that might look like. Our third and final tip is to think about who it is you're speaking to and recognize that individuality plays a part in the way that we digest information. Now, I spoke earlier about the first part of our 5-part series, and if you took our Spark assessment, the little piece of our Spark assessment, you would have received one of these 2 different reports, identifying whether you were more of a builder or more of a maintainer and where your dominant traits lie. Our full flushed out Spark assessment has 4 additional personality partners just like this, with one that identifies our responsiveness to feedback and how we innately digest and synthesize feedback. One is not better than the other, but they are just different ways of interpreting information and different ways of communicating how we would like to have feedback provided to us or how we provide feedback to other people, just innately as well, as I mentioned. So if you've already received this and you're curious about learning more and the full Spark assessment, you can reach out and we can certainly hook you up with that. And we run through this full Spark assessment in our Spark leadership training as well. So something to chat about at the end. But I want to finish off with our third point here and our third tip for you in delivering effective feedback, which is understanding individuality, right? So as I mentioned, knowing where your innate strengths lie. And also that allows us to limit assumptions, or helps us limit assumptions, I should say. So we can learn about how we digest and interpret and internalize feedback and how that might be different from the way that our team digests feedback. We can do this a number of ways. Of course, we could take the Spark assessment. We could ask questions of our team. How do you like feedback? How do you like to have feedback provided to you? Am I providing enough feedback? What's your preferred method of feedback? Would you like it in writing? Would you like to sit down and have a conversation? Of course, I will say that anything that is quite sensitive in nature, I would recommend sitting down or at least getting on a phone call or a Zoom call so that we can understand nonverbal communication, but opening the doors to have those conversations and co-create what a feedback loop looks like with your team members is incredibly impactful. We want to make sure that we're having these conversations so that we can show up, we can provide feedback in a way that lands, and this also allows us to hold one another accountable so that we can provide feedback in such a way that it's actioned on and it's helping us achieve the results that we want at the end of the day. So 3 tips again, because this is just a little tidbit. We could chunk way down and get super granular about ways that we can and tips and tools that we can use to improve our feedback delivery. But as a starter, for high level, 3 tips that I would recommend you walk out of here with today. The first is set expectations early. And if you're saying, well, we have all of these things, we have job descriptions, then these are expectations. You can go back and you can have conversations about expectations as you start to see whether it's expectations being met, exceeded, or needing course correction. And that's where you can readjust and reestablish those expectations, but making sure that there's clarity surrounding what that looks like. The next is to keep capacity for retention of information and for actual action in mind, remembering that we only internalize 126 bits of information a minute or a second, I apologize. Or another way to look at that is that we really only retain about 50% of what we hear in a conversation. So there is a good chance that either we keep it short and concise and stick to 1 to 3 pieces of feedback, or we will have to have the same conversations over and over again, reiterating similar points. And the final tip is to remember that feedback should always be individualized. You're thinking about the recipient in the way that you're providing this feedback. You're eliminating any assumptions that you might have about the way in which they prefer to receive feedback, unless you already have had those conversations and know, in which case that's a perception and that's wonderful. But otherwise, we want to take any feelings that we have surrounding feedback, shelf those, look at feedback as an opportunity to be kind to somebody else, to help foster their growth and development, and then walk into that conversation and give them the tools to help them grow and learn, just in the way that you'd like to. With that being said, we are at time for today. That was a very short little snippet of how you can effectively deliver feedback, some changes that you can make, and some of the common barriers that you might notice either yourself or your team might be facing day to day. If we have any questions, please feel free to ask now. You can come off mic, you can rely on the chat. And before you take off, we would love to hear how you're finding these 5-part series so far. We are on part 2, so please, if you have your phone nearby, feel free to open your camera, scan this QR code. The quick little survey should only take you about 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how in depth you'd like to go. And we'd love to have you practice and flex your feedback muscle by providing us with some feedback as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. Any questions?
I have a question. Actually, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that throughout your whole conversation, I always had questions, and I had a ton of questions, but you answered them all. So that's good, obviously. The other thing is, and I know you said you didn't want to get too granular about it, but I mean, there are a million platforms out there that can help document and for these objectives for the people or their expectations, where you can edit it, as opposed to, say, having a stand-up meeting every day or something like that. There's like PeopleBox or Trackstar, whatever you want to use for your annual review, because it's really difficult to even review somebody after a year, when commonly people are like, well, what did you do in the last month? That was good. And forgetting, what was done in 8 to 10 months ago. So it's really important that, you document these accomplishments and expectations for the awareness, because you could use that on various ways, whether it be an increase in, salary, or, moving that person and finding out that they're not capable of certain things, and they're what they're good at is better used in somewhere else. So I love what you said, but I find that it's really important that you find some way, like you said, to regularly communicate it. Otherwise, everything just gets lost, right?
Yes, yeah, a central hub. Thank you for bringing that up. That's an excellent recommendation, and we'll make note of the recommendations that you made there as well when we go back and watch the recording of a couple of those online platforms, because I know people use a running Google document, or they have some kind of live document or platform, absolutely, where they can. Everybody, both parties, I should say, have visibility of what those conversations are, what those expectations are. And you really, Steve, you touched on a very important part and piece, and that is highlighting the accomplishments and the contributions of a team member throughout the year as well. And ways, one of the things that I think a lot of leaders get focused on and dialed in on, and these are conversations that we have often, is that we're looking at the improvements that can be made. And that means that a lot of the time the accomplishments get pushed to the wayside in lieu of, here are the things that need to improve, or need to be improved upon. So I really love that you also mentioned having that sort of hype document in a way, of both the accomplishments and the constructive feedback that is collected throughout the year. So awesome, thank you. And I'm glad that your questions were answered throughout. That's good to know. Did you have any outstanding questions?
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. It was great.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. And thank you for showing up. Always great to have you here. And for your suggestion at the end too. I really, really appreciate that. We'll definitely make sure that that's included.